On a crowded city sidewalk, a CEO laughed at a street musician song, but his laughter slowly faded when he realized the song was telling his own past. That afternoon, the heart of the city buzzed with the usual noise: car horns, hurried footsteps, and the distant hum of office towers. In front of a five-star restaurant, Raymond Hartwell, the CEO of a massive tech company called Hartwell Innovations, had just stepped out from an executive meeting. He looked sharp in his navy blue suit, polished shoes, and a luxury watch hugging his wrist. A chauffeur opened the car door for him, but Raymond didn't get in right away. He heard something, a faint guitar melody floating through the urban noise. Just a few meters away, a worn-out old man sat leaning against a lamppost, strumming a battered guitar. His clothes were shabby, his hair graying, and his voice rough. He was singing a song about someone who fought their way up from the bottom, yet was never seen or heard. Raymond narrowed his eyes and chuckled. "Look at that," he said to his assistant who stood nearby. "If my life had gone like that song, I'd be the one begging on a sidewalk, not running a company." His assistant gave a polite smile, but the musician kept singing. And with each line, the lyrics began to sound oddly familiar. There was one verse that made Raymond freeze. He came with hope, but was turned away for lacking a name. He knelt down, but was met with silence and laughter. Raymond raised an eyebrow. He slowly turned toward the musician. The song continued. They said a poor boy has no place in the world of business. He scoffed. "Melodrama," he muttered. But something stirred in his chest. The words weren't just poetic. They were disturbingly specific. The musician never looked directly at Raymond, yet his voice, his words, seemed aimed straight at him. A few passers-by began to slow down. Some stopped to listen. But Raymond, for the first time in a long while, wasn't laughing. He stood frozen, and without realizing, his feet began to take him closer to the street performer. From behind, his chauffeur called out, "Mr. Raymond, your car is ready." But the CEO didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the old man with the guitar and the raspy voice. The song was growing deeper, more precise, like it was digging up something long buried. Raymond stood still. The old man's voice was rough but steady, pouring emotion into each word. The melody was simple, just a few repeating chords, but the words, they were growing uncomfortably specific. He wore shoes with holes, his coat too thin for winter. He handed in his resume to men in suits, but was told the door wasn't open for him. They didn't see his eyes, only his clothes. They didn't hear his words, only his silence. Raymond felt a strange pressure in his chest. His assistant leaned in and whispered, "Sir, should we go?" But Raymond didn't answer. His mind was beginning to drift. There was a time, years ago, when a young man had come into his office wearing second-hand clothes. That man had pleaded for a chance to intern, saying he didn't have the right connections, but he had skills and determination. Raymond had brushed him off. He remembered laughing after the man left. "Another desperate case," he had said to his team. Now, the memory felt heavier than ever. The street musician kept singing. He believed in building things. Not for money, not for power, but for meaning. But the gates to the towers were locked tight. Because dreams don't mean anything when your shoes are dirty. People around them had started filming with their phones. A small crowd had formed. But the only person who couldn't move was Raymond. Raymond's eyes narrowed as the lyrics continued. The melody hadn't changed, but the mood in the air had. It was no longer just a street performance. It had become something else. A quiet confrontation. A mirror. He waited in the lobby, ignored by the man in the blue suit. He left with his head down. No calls. No words. Just silence. But someday, he said, he'd tell the story. Not in boardrooms, but in streets. And the man in the blue suit would finally hear it. Raymond felt like the breath had been knocked out of him. Blue suit. He was wearing one. He always wore one. Back then, even years ago, blue had been his signature color. Elegant, refined, a silent sign of control. He had no doubt who the song was referring to. He stepped forward slightly, the gravel beneath his leather shoes crunching. The musician didn't flinch. He strummed gently, his voice steady. For a moment, Raymond thought of interrupting. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Behind him, someone whispered, "Is he talking about that guy?" "I think he is," another replied. "That's Raymond Hartwell, right?" The name passed through the small crowd like a wind. Phones were still recording. A few murmurs of recognition rose. Raymond was used to being recognized, but never like this. Never while standing still, with nothing to say. He looked at the musician's hands, rough, calloused, steady on the strings. This wasn't just performance. It was testimony. And Raymond knew this wasn't coincidence. This was a reckoning. The next verse felt colder. Not because of the air. The sun was still warm over the sidewalks. But because of the memory each word dragged from Raymond's mind. He once mailed a letter. Handwritten. No stamp. Just hope. Addressed to a man whose name was always on the news. He waited outside the glass tower for hours, until security asked him to leave. He left with frozen fingers and a burning heart. Raymond felt like he had heard these words before, not in song, in real life. Years ago, when Hartwell Innovations was still climbing fast, a security guard had brought him a letter. The envelope had no return address, just a first name on the corner, Eli. Inside was a letter written in neat, slanted handwriting. The writer had spoken of admiration and of needing a break. He had built software tools on his own. He wanted to help, even unpaid. Raymond had tossed the letter aside. He told himself there wasn't time to waste on anyone who couldn't follow proper channels. No resume, no background, just a letter. Now, that name returned in the next verse. "I signed it, Eli." Not that he ever read it. Maybe he did. Maybe he laughed. But I kept the words alive. I turned them into songs. Because even ignored voices deserve to echo. Raymond's eyes locked onto the musician's face. The beard had grown long. The hair was thinning. But the voice was steady. Honest. Could it really be him? The boy from the letter? From the lobby? From the cold? Raymond's throat tightened. And still, the song went on. By now, the sidewalk had become a small amphitheater. Commuters slowed down. Some stopped completely. Cars honked in the distance, but the sound was muffled under the growing presence of the song. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every word came like a slow knock to the chest. And Raymond, the man who once filled auditoriums with keynote speeches, stood silent, surrounded by strangers holding phones. The musician adjusted his guitar. His fingers moved slower now, more deliberate. Then, without lifting his eyes, he began the next verse. He learned code by candlelight, typed on borrowed keyboards, fixed old laptops just to study. He dreamed of wires and circuits, not wealth. But when he climbed the glass steps, no one asked what he built, only what he wore. Raymond's assistant, who had stood silently all this time, finally whispered, "Sir, do you want to ask him to stop?" Raymond didn't respond, because something in him knew this couldn't be stopped. It wasn't just a song. It was truth, the kind he had never cared to hear before. From the corner of his eye, he saw a mother holding her daughter, whispering something as they both watched. The child was maybe 6. Her eyes were wide, her hands tucked under her chin. More people gathered, not for the music, but for the man it was about. Him. Suddenly, it felt like all the windows of the surrounding towers were looking down on him. The suits inside, if they even noticed, might be sipping coffee, unaware that their own king stood frozen in the street, being dismantled by a song. The next lyric felt like a verdict. He once believed the world had room for the poor, but the ones in towers proved him wrong. So now he sings for those still outside. Raymond's hands curled slightly into fists, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The name Eli echoed in Raymond's mind, growing louder with each verse. He hadn't thought of that letter in over a decade, not since it landed quietly on his desk and left just as quickly, swept into the trash bin without a second glance. Back then, it was just another day, another hopeful nobody. Now, he began to remember more. There had been a knock on the glass door downstairs, not the main entrance, but the side lobby. A young man stood there, soaked from the rain. His jacket had holes. His shoes were wrapped in duct tape. Raymond never spoke to him. The receptionist had called security. The man had been escorted away. But he remembered watching from the 10th floor as the figure walked off into the dark. He never saw him again. Until now. The next part of the song changed tempo, just slightly. Not enough to feel like a new melody, but enough to suggest the tone was shifting. The street musician's voice grew lower, almost like he was whispering something sacred. He found warmth in wires and silence. Built his world with discarded code. When the world closed its doors, he wrote his own. But he never forgot the man behind the glass, the one who never saw him. Raymond's lips parted slightly. The lyrics weren't just cutting. They were surgical, precise. They didn't come from imagination. They came from memory. His memory. People around him murmured now. Is this a protest song? Is that about the guy in the suit? Wait, is that really Hartwell? He could feel their eyes. But more than that, he felt the weight of something he had long buried. Not guilt, not yet. Recognition. The kind that made the ground feel uneven, even beneath $1,000 shoes. He took a half step forward, but the song continued without him. Raymond tried to speak. His mouth moved, but the words never made it past his throat. The song held the street captive. Even the cars passing by it slowed down. A city that never stopped was suddenly listening. The musician plucked a single soft note, letting the silence stretch for just a moment. Then he sang a verse that cracked something inside Raymond. He waited in rain, in snow, in heat, not for money, not for pity, but for someone to say, "Come in, show me what you built." But the glass man never opened the door. He had no time for bare hands and big dreams. Raymond remembered that phrase. He had said it in a boardroom meeting when someone from HR suggested offering internship slots to walk-ins, kids from rough neighborhoods, no college pedigree. Raymond had laughed and said, "We don't have time for bare hands and big dreams." Now, hearing it repeated like an accusation in a song, it didn't sound clever. It sounded cruel. He looked around. No one was smiling, not even the ones who had laughed earlier. The crowd had turned quiet, thoughtful. Even the air felt heavier. The musician played on. The glass man had everything, but he never looked back. Not once. Not until the music came for him. And when it didn't shout. It whispered what he threw away. The last line landed like a weight on Raymond's chest. He had thrown it away. Not just a letter, not just a name, a person, a chance. And now, the music was whispering it all back to him, in front of everyone. Someone in the crowd stepped forward and dropped a folded note into the musician's guitar case. Others followed. Coins, bills, silent gestures. But Raymond remained still. He wasn't sure if he was allowed to move anymore. The next chord struck deeper, not louder, not harsher, but steadier. The kind of sound that carries across memory and time. Raymond no longer heard a song. He heard an indictment. The musician let his voice fall into a rhythm both natural and deliberate, like someone walking a path he knew by heart. The boy once wrote code with broken keys, watched tutorials through cracked screens. And when he finally finished something beautiful, no one cared, because the man he admired never opened the file. Raymond flinched. That line, "never opened the file," wasn't poetic. It was literal. He remembered now. A USB drive had been left at the front desk once, attached to a crumpled resume. Security had handed it to Raymond. He tossed it in a drawer without ever plugging it in. Later, he threw it away. He hadn't even told anyone. The musician sang on. They said he should dress better, speak better, know better people. But none of them ever asked what he could build with his hands. So he built something else, a song that could break a window from the outside. Raymond stared at him, not just because of the words, but because of how precise they were. Each lyric wasn't metaphor. It was fact. The drawstring on the old man's jacket, the way he adjusted the strap of his guitar between verses, the occasional limp when he shifted weight. It all added up. Raymond was no longer guessing. He was certain this was Eli, the boy with the duct-taped shoes, the boy whose resume smelled like rain, the boy who had once said, "I just want one person to listen." Raymond had not listened, But now he was being forced to, with no way to leave, no way to undo the silence. And the worst part, Eli had never raised his voice. Not once. The hush that had settled over the street was no longer passive. It had weight, attention, the kind of silence that fills a courtroom just before the verdict is read. Raymond could feel it. He wasn't just a man watching a performance now. He was a man standing trial in the middle of the street. And the jury? They were everywhere. Filming, watching, whispering. The next verse arrived without warning, like a hand tapping his shoulder. He never needed pity. He never asked for revenge. All he wanted was for someone to say, "I remember you," not as a mistake, not as a file in the trash, but as a mind worth hearing. Raymond took a step back, not out of fear, out of shame, and he couldn't stop the memory that suddenly rose to the surface, the moment he had joked with his investors about how tenacity is only useful when packaged correctly. They had laughed. So had he. That joke now echoed as mockery. The musician looked up for the first time. Briefly, just a flick of the eyes. But it was enough. Raymond saw the recognition. Not hatred, not even anger. Just presence. Eli knew exactly who he was singing to. And still he didn't stop. I never got to the top floor. Never got the handshake. But I found another way. I built my voice from spare parts and silence. And now the man who never listened is here. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's talking about Hartwell, right?" Another answered, "He deserves to hear this." Raymond swallowed hard. His collar felt tight, his chest heavier. He had spent his life building things, companies, teams, fortunes. But now, everything he built felt small, because what stood in front of him wasn't just a musician. It was a man who had turned rejection into an anthem. And Raymond was no longer the audience. He was the subject. Raymond had always believed he controlled the room. He controlled boardrooms, quarterly meetings, investor calls. Even when he walked into crowded halls, people adjusted their tone. They shifted in their seats. His presence alone had that effect. But not here. Not now. Here, his presence was just part of the scenery. The musician didn't pause, didn't stutter, didn't acknowledge the man in the blue suit standing a few feet away, stiff with discomfort. The performance continued as if Raymond didn't matter. Because maybe, finally, he didn't. Some men think their names are carved in steel, that towers and titles make them untouchable. But they forget music doesn't need doors. It slips through the cracks. It finds them, even when they don't want to listen. Someone in the crowd clapped quietly, not for celebration, but for the truth. No one else followed. There was no applause, only listening. Raymond felt something move in his chest. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. An unwelcome honesty pressing into the spaces he usually kept locked. The people surrounding him weren't fans. They weren't enemies either. They were witnesses. The verse continued. He learned that silence can be louder than any stage. That rejection is its own kind of fuel. So he sang not for revenge, but for memory. And when the glass man finally heard him, he would understand what he had thrown away. The words were no longer just commentary. They were truth. And that truth was beginning to settle, like dust on the shoulders of a man who had spent too many years walking above it all. Raymond looked down at his shoes. Shiny, untouched. They had never walked the kind of road this man had walked. He suddenly wondered how far he had actually traveled in life. Despite all his miles, Raymond's eyes didn't lift. His thoughts were louder than the city. Every line of the song was like a page from a journal he had never read, but somehow had written, not with a pen, but with every moment of ignorance, every decision to look the other way. The musician struck a few gentler chords. Slower now, like winding down a memory. I was told to wait my turn, to follow the rules, but the rules were built for others. I never broke them. I was simply never invited to play. The crowd remained frozen, as if bound by the gravity of something they couldn't quite name. Even the children, who usually squirmed and laughed in moments like these, stood still, their curiosity sharpened by the unusual stillness in the adults around them. Raymond lifted his gaze, not toward the musician, toward the people watching him. A man near the front looked straight at him, not with anger, but disappointment, as if to say, "Now you see." For the first time in his public life, Raymond didn't know how to respond. He had spoken at world summits, presented on stages in New York, London, Tokyo. He'd faced competitors, press, political backlash. But not this. Not a song that stripped him down in front of ordinary people and left no room for denial. The musician's voice softened. I didn't need his money. I needed his belief. I didn't want his empire. I wanted to be seen. And when I finally stopped waiting, I realized my voice was stronger than his silence. Raymond blinked, and for a moment, the street blurred. He clenched his jaw, but the lump in his throat stayed. It wasn't just about what he had done, or hadn't done. It was about what he never noticed. A young man's entire life was rerouted by a single closed door. And now, that same man had built a stage from concrete and pain and made Raymond listen. The musician shifted his weight. A breeze passed the narrow avenue, tugging at the torn collar of his coat. Then his fingers returned to the strings. No hesitation. No flourish. Just truth. He stood in the cold while others drove past. He knocked while others looked away. And when the world said, "You're not enough," he wrote a song that proved otherwise. Not to rise above them, but to reach those still beneath. Raymond exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what his silence had taught others, what it had permitted, what it had stolen. He had told himself he was busy, that he was building something important. That time was money, that his attention belonged to shareholders and strategies, not letters from strangers. But now, in this moment, none of that felt like protection. It felt like armor that no longer fit. The musician's voice dipped lower, a calm warning. He saw towers rise, but never forgot the ground, because he lived in both, the silence of the street and the echo of rejection. And now he sings so others don't forget, that the ones they ignore may carry the truest song. Someone in the crowd let out a faint gasp. A few nodded slowly, knowingly. Others just watched with wide, unsure eyes. Raymond turned slightly. Behind him, two young men in work uniforms whispered to each other. One of them pointed discreetly toward the musician and said, "That guy's been out here for months. I never knew he had something like this in him." The other replied, "That's the thing, right? We never know." Raymond looked back at Eli. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't performing out of bitterness. He was doing something else entirely, something Raymond had never mastered despite all his corporate success. He was telling the truth and letting it hurt. The wind shifted again, not cold, but enough to make Raymond feel exposed. His suit suddenly felt too heavy. The chorus returned, not with grandeur, but with the weary force of someone who had carried it for years. He never asked for justice, just recognition, not as a threat, not as a failure, but as someone who knocked and was ignored. And now, the man behind the glass hears every word. Raymond looked down. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished black shoes. But it wasn't his face he saw. It was younger, soaked, standing behind a security desk, holding a folder like it meant everything. It was Eli, and in that split second, Raymond wished he could step back into that memory, open the door, say something, but that time was gone. The crowd had shifted, not just physically, emotionally. They no longer looked at the CEO with curiosity or admiration. The glow of his title had dimmed. What remained was a man, one who had built high walls, and now stood outside them listening. Eli sang on. "I don't need forgiveness. I don't need revenge. I just needed him to hear. Because silence was enough. And now the silence is his." The verse settled over the street, like dusk. Raymond felt the air pull tighter around him. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but he knew words, especially his, would sound hollow now. He had built empires with his voice, but he had destroyed something far more human with his silence. Eli ended the verse with a gentle pull of the strings. Then quiet, real quiet. Even the city itself seemed to pause. And in that pause, Raymond heard everything he had never listened to. For a long moment, no one moved. No one clapped. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop, as if unwilling to break the stillness Eli had created. Raymond stood frozen. The final note still vibrated in his ears, and yet the absence of sound now carried more weight than the music ever had. People around him exchanged glances, not curious anymore, but knowing, quietly respectful. They had all witnessed something, not entertainment, a confession, a reckoning. Eli didn't look up. He gently rested the guitar on his lap and reached into his pocket for a cloth, slowly wiping the worn strings, like a ritual, like the performance was over, and it had never been for applause. Raymond took one hesitant step forward, then another. People instinctively made space. Eli didn't move. He didn't look. He just sat there, still wiping his strings. Raymond knelt slowly beside the guitar case, something his body hadn't done in years. He stared into the open case. Among the coins and bills was the folded note someone had dropped earlier. On its edge was a short sentence, scribbled in pencil. I heard every word. Raymond's hand trembled. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his sleek metal wallet, and slid a business card between the strings of a folded bill. Then he stopped. He looked at the card. His name, his title, his office. He put it back. Instead, he reached into his coat again, and this time pulled out something different. A pen. He grabbed a napkin from a nearby cafe table and wrote one word on it. Listening. No name. No request. No contact info. Just that. He placed it gently in the case and rose to his feet. Eli still didn't look up. He didn't need to. Raymond stood silently for a few more seconds, the crowd watching him with unreadable expressions. Then he turned, not toward his waiting car, but down the sidewalk, away from the towers, toward a side street he hadn't walked in years. The song was over, but something had begun. Raymond's footsteps echoed differently now, not because of the pavement, but because of the silence that followed him, a silence full of meaning, full of eyes, full of everything he could no longer ignore. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew it wasn't back to the glass tower. Behind him, the crowd slowly dispersed. A few stayed back, placing coins into the guitar case. Some approached Eli, not with words, but with nods, gestures of gratitude, of quiet respect. One child walked up and placed a flower beside his boot. Eli said nothing. He didn't need to. He had said everything. As Raymond turned the corner and left the block behind, his mind replayed the song, not as music, but as memory, as a chain of moments he had forgotten, as a series of choices he couldn't take back. He thought of the boy in the rain, the crumpled resume, the USB drive that never got plugged in, the letter toss without reading, the silence. He had told himself all those years that the world moved too fast to care about every voice. But now he knew some voices never stop speaking. They just find other ways. Ways that eventually reach you, even if it takes years, even if it breaks you. Raymond reached a quiet intersection, away from the glass and steel, where the sounds of the city softened. He stopped at a bench, sat down, loosened his tie. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small, and that was exactly what he needed to feel. He looked up at the city skyline. His name still glowed from the top of one of the tallest towers. It would stay there, probably for years. But today, something else had been carved into the city. Not in glass, not in steel, but in people, in silence, in song. Somewhere behind him, a new melody began. But this time, it was no longer just about him. It was about everyone watching, everyone who had ever been unheard. And one man who finally stopped long enough to listen